Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Wilson, and this evening I will be doing a presentation on confined spaces. The first question that we come to when we talk about confined spaces is, what is a confined space? A confined space can be found at many job sites, and is definitely something that needs to be taken very seriously when working in or around with confined spaces. According to OSHA, a confined space is a space large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work. The space has limited or restricted means of entry or exit and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. Confined spaces can be found at many job sites, like I mentioned earlier, and they can be very many things. Confined spaces include, but are not limited to, underground vaults, tanks, storage bins, manholes, pits, silos, access vessels, and pipelines. Now, these are only a few of the confined spaces that you may find in a job site. There can be other confined spaces such as tankers. Trenches can be considered a confined space, so you really have to watch out with what you're doing. Another really important thing about confined spaces is the safety of them and how you go about that. And to understand that, you're going to have to understand a couple of main components with confined spaces, what each person is that is associated with a confined space. The first one that we're going to talk about is the entrant. An entrant is someone that is entering a confined space to perform some form of work. This is going to be the individual that is down there either welding, pipe fitting, bolting, cleaning, whatever is occurring in the confined space. This is going to be the gentleman that is down there doing the work. The next individual that we're going to talk about in the confined space is going to be the attendant. This is a very important individual when working in confined spaces. The attendant monitors the safety of the entrant at all times. Constantly in communication with the entrant. This is extremely important. If anything goes wrong, the attendant is going to be one of the very first people to know about it. They have to be in communication with the entrant at all times. In charge of calling jobs off if any form of danger arises. Like I said again, very important person to have during confined spaces. The last person that we're going to talk about is going to be the entry supervisor. He is the main man in charge of the entire entry. Checks all safety levels before allowing entry into any space. Signs the permit, which we will discuss much further just in a little while. And may also be an attendant or an entrant. So that doesn't mean that he's just the boss. He is just the supervisor over the job. If we will look here, I have a diagram drawn out of a little bit of what a confined space may look like. This here would be a tank. And if you will look, here is the entrant here. Here is the supervisor or the attendant. And you can see that they have the line hooked to the entrant. The gas fumes are being sucked out through a vacuum into the air, so there's no harmful gases. And they have a ladder, emergency exit ladder, and a lifeline to the safety harness here. When dealing with confined spaces, one can come into contact with many hazards. These hazards can be found in many different confined spaces. Possible hazards that can be found in confined spaces can be oxygen deficiency. Of course, everyone knows you have to have oxygen to survive. Oxygen deficiency is something that needs to be taken very seriously when working with confined spaces. Number two, a very common hazard is combustibles. You will find methane, hydrogen, acetylene, propane, and gasoline fumes. Any of these can be present in confined spaces. Some more hazards that you may run into in confined spaces is toxic material, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, welding fumes, corrosives. Any of these can be found in confined spaces just depending on what kind of confined space that you're working on. So one has to be very careful about these as well. Nobody wants to come into contact with toxic material if they can help it. Electricity is one that is overlooked quite a bit from my understanding. in confined spaces. You really have to watch out for open wires, naked wires, any kind of electrical wires that may be present in confined spaces. Just really easy to overlook sometimes because you're thinking about the gases, the combustibles, the fumes, the oxygen, everything else, and not always got electric in mind. So electricity is definitely one that needs to be concerned. Mechanical hazards, if you are in a confined space that has a mechanical hazard like a mixer or a concrete mixer or a rock crusher, things of that nature, you need to really be careful with moving parts. Mechanicals can hurt you just as fast as toxic material or electricity or anything else can. The types of confined spaces that we're going to cover today are two. We're going to cover the permit required and the non-permit required. Some may think the non-permit required are not as important or not as dangerous. That is very false. No matter what kind of confined space that you are in, one needs to be very careful. They can be just as dangerous, permit or no permit. The first one that we're going to talk about today is the permit required. Permit required confined space, just to give you an idea, contains or has the potential to contain hazardous atmosphere. Like we said again, toxic, fumes, electricity, anything of that nature. Permit required has the potential to contain those. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. Also has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section below. Permit required also contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. So to sum it up, a permit required is going to be your more dangerous, not to say that they're both not dangerous, but the permit required is going to be your more dangerous, has a more viable reason to say that there is danger imminent. This is just a sample permit. You can see that it's quite a lot, time in, time out, exposure time, atmosphere checks, temperature checks, all sorts of things that you have to go over on when you fill out one of these permits. A permit required entry procedure. The first thing that you need to do when going over or fixing to enter into a confined space that is permit required is create a plan. This could be a life-saving step if something goes wrong in a confined space. Cannot stress enough how important creating a plan is. A pre-comprised plan has the ability to speed up a recovery or rescue in the event of injury. If everyone knows what their job is beforehand, there is no confusion during the emergency. So comprise a plan. Number one step. Entry continued. The number two step is going to be to isolate the space. You don't want any other space that that you can come into contact with that may not be ventilated properly or may not have been checked for electricity, gases, fumes, anything of that nature. So you want to isolate the space that you're working in. Close all the doors. Everything that you can do there. Ventilate the space. Obviously we need to ventilate. Conduct briefing. Complete permit. Test the atmosphere. And enter the space. Now we're going to cover all of these very thoroughly in just a second. Isolating the space. Again, very important. Check to make sure that the space has been isolated from hazards as best as possible. This may include closing doors, vents, valves, flanges, etc. Empty the space of any material that may be present that could present a danger. Check for electrical and moving parts if present, and check for hazardous waste or residue. Again, we've covered these hazards before. Definitely want to check through all of these and isolate your space the best that you can. Ventilate the space. Cannot stress enough how important this is. Leading back to the oxygen deficiency, definitely want to ventilate your workspaces. No one wants to be breathing carbon monoxide or acetylene, propane, anything like that. Ventilation is extremely important in the case that there may be contaminated air. Use fans, vents, doors, anything that you can, as long as they produce clean, non-contaminated air. Remember, the larger the space, the more ventilation you will need. Conduct a briefing. Again, very important. Goes back to the pre-compromised plan. Go back over the pre-plan. Make sure everyone that is working attends. Very important. If you have just the entrant and the attendant at the pre-plan, something goes wrong, someone comes to help, not going to be good. Make sure everyone that is at the job site that is going to be associated with the confined space attends. Review the objectives and safety of the job. Very important. And also you want to review your permit before entry. The permit's very important. The permit could be one of the things that if you follow can save your life. Complete the entry permit. The entry permit is not completed until right before entry. Permits vary between job sites, but almost all permits will be OSHA certified. Complete permit and receive the signature on of the entry supervisor. Permit is only good for 12 hours and only covers the space listed. That's very important. If you have a permit, it's not good for a week or in the entire job site or until the work is done. It's only good for 12 hours. Every 12 hours you need to fill out a new permit, have the supervisor sign it off. Test the atmosphere. Extremely important. Easy step to overlook, but extremely important. This is one of the most overlooked but important steps in confined space safety. The atmosphere needs to be tested to ensure the air quality is safe for the working environment. Electrical, hazardous waste, residue, things like that can be seen. The air quality cannot be seen. So you definitely want to check this. Test after proper ventilation and during the working procedure. Just to be sure if you're welding, you don't have a gas leak in one of your lines, things like that. Test the oxygen levels. We went over that a couple of times. You always want to test your oxygen levels, and you want to test for hazardous fumes and gases to be present. So always test the atmosphere before entering your confined space. Here I have a diagram of a gentleman testing the atmosphere. You want to test from the outside, top to bottom. Here it shows methane is lighter than air, so it's going to be more towards the top. Carbon monoxide is the same as air, so it's going to be more towards the center. And then your hydrogen sulfide is heavier than air, so it's going to be more towards the bottom. So when testing, you just don't want to test the top and say, oh, it seems to be good. You want to test from top to bottom all the way down, because different gases can be at different levels. Again, the gentleman testing. Double check. Recheck yourself and team before entering the space. Again, safety, safety, safety. It can save your life in confined spaces. Everyone knows their job. Make sure that everyone knows what their job and purpose is in the confined space. Everyone knows what to do in an emergency. We've talked about the pre-plan, going back over it again, having the meeting. Again, make sure everyone knows what to do in case of an emergency. It could save an individual's life. Make sure that the permit is complete and the atmosphere is good. Again, double check. Cannot be too safe. After you have done all of these procedures, then you can enter into the confined space safely. After all these objectives have been completed, one may enter the space to proceed with work. Again, that was covering permit required confined spaces. We're now going to talk about non-permit confined spaces. Extremely dangerous, just as dangerous as what the permit requireds can be. So don't let it don't require a permit, it's not going to be that big of a deal. That attitude can get you killed. Do not do that. A non-permit does not present a life-threatening hazard and does not require a permit for entry. It still needs to be taken very seriously. It's noted here. Should perform same safety precautions as in a permit required space, minus completing the permit. Of course, if there's no permit, then you cannot complete a permit. Entry for non-permit space. Comprise a plan. Again, cannot go over how important that is. No matter what confined space that you're in, you need to comprise the plan. Isolate the space. Again, vents, doors, whatever you can shut to isolate that space. Make sure that you're only working in the space that's been tested and proven to be safe. Ventilate the space. Vacuums, whatever you can do, doors, vents. Make sure that you have ventilation open. Conduct the briefing. Again, cannot go over how important that is. Conduct your briefing with your individuals. Make sure everyone knows their plan, their job, and where they need to be and what they need to do. Test the atmosphere. Top to bottom, is like we discussed earlier, very important. And enter into the space. Training, cannot go over how important training is, no matter if you're talking confined spaces or not. I mean, the best athletes in the world train, the best workers in the world train. Training is extremely important in any form of job especially confined spaces. Excuse me. Here, training is one of the most important elements of any form of job. Proper training can help to greatly reduce the chance of injury, danger, or improper job functioning. So again, proper training, it does not take that long. Training can definitely save your life, something that you want to do for sure. The conclusion of this, there is no doubt that confined spaces can be a dangerous part of a job site. However, if one follows the proper steps and has required the proper training, confined spaces can be as safe of a place as standing above the space itself. As long as you do what you're supposed to do, go over your plan, test the atmosphere, ventilate, isolate, safety first, it can be just as safe as being above. At the conclusion of that, if anyone has any questions or comments, I will be more than happy to answer at this time. If not, then I appreciate you listening to my presentation on confined spaces. I hope that I provided some information for you that you can take to the job site and be a much safer worker. Please take one moment to recognize my references, and thank you.